Syria is being torn apart.
This is a doomed regime as well as a murdering regime.
The regime is fighting for its life, and the once peaceful opposition is fighting back.
I think we should help these people by all means.
As global and regional powers fight their own battles,
this council stands silent when governments massacre their own people.
And the president remains defiant. Can the revolution succeed before the country falls apart? This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. Over the past year, we've taken special interest in the Arab uprisings and dedicated a number of episodes to better understand the evolution of the Arab revolutions from Tunisia to Yemen through Egypt, Libya, and Bahrain. Syria has proved to be the most complicated and certainly the most dangerous of them all. As the uprising enters its second year, what started as a relatively peaceful upheaval against repressive dictatorship is spiraling out of control. With more than 8,000 Syrians dead, 250,000 displaced, and countless imprisoned or tortured, the opposition is arming itself in self-defense, and its regional supporters are chipping in with Western complicity. In the shadow of the international polarization and paralysis, the militarization of the revolution, coupled with the regime's bloody crackdown, will most probably pave the way to civil war and even lead to the breakup of the country, with dramatic spillover effects on Syria's neighbors. Why is the path to change so rocky and so long? What are the future scenarios for Syria? Will the global and regional powers allow the escalation to war to continue? Will they intervene or stop it? Or will they inflame an already volatile situation? I will address all of these questions and more with my guests. NIKOLAOS van Dam, a Dutch academic who's written extensively on the Middle East, including the struggle for power in Syria, politics and society under Assad and the Ba'ath Party, and a former diplomat with extensive service in the Middle East, including Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, Egypt, and Turkey, and many others. Robert FISK, a renowned British journalist who covered the Middle East for 3 decades, has authored several books, including The Great War for Civilization, The Conquest of the Middle East. And last but not least, Anas al-Abdi is the chairman of the Movement for Justice and Development and a member of the Secretariat General of the Syrian National Council. But first, a quick reminder of the year that changed the country forever.
The weeks slip by. The death toll climbs. The casualties mount. And the moral outrage grows ever louder. Syria is being torn apart. What started a year ago as a peaceful protest in the southern town of Daraa demanding limited justice and reform has turned into a national upheaval demanding regime change, all the while becoming ever more violent and chaotic. Even those who merely poke fun at the regime are treated with ferocious brutality. Ali Ferzat's cartoons have long been hugely popular in the region, but when Assad took offense to one of his drawings, he ordered thugs to beat him and smash his hands.
I'm just one person compared to thousands of martyrs who paid and still pay the price for freedom. This will continue and no one will stop it. The price we're paying is small for the country and the people.
President Assad has made belated promises to reform and hold referendums and elections.
First, we need the people's support to achieve this reform.
But these overtures have been dismissed as bogus and firmly rejected. Syrians continue to pour onto the streets right across the country. Meanwhile, the regime continues its brutal crackdown against the largely peaceful protest movement, leading to thousands of dead and injured, a nation humiliated and bruised.
You have rarely seen a situation where the level of violence, human rights abuse and torture is as severe and as gruesome as is the case in Syria. We're talking about a very, very serious human rights situation.
Even the Secretary General of the United Nations isn't mincing his words.
The Syrian government has failed to fulfill its responsibility to protect its own people, and instead has subjected citizens in several cities to military assault and disproportionate use of force.
Instead, the Syrian opposition has been arming in self-defense, and more Syrian army soldiers are defecting to join the opposition forces. International sanctions are crippling the Syrian economy. The regime's inability to pay salaries to its soldiers and bureaucrats is diminishing its capacity to rule and threatening an implosion from within. Judging from Syrian state television, the Assad regime is defending the country against a foreign terrorist insurgency. The question is, does the regime itself believe these claims? Evidence clearly suggests otherwise. A trove of intercepted emails appear to show an Assad-led regime with a callous indifference to the brutality of the crackdown. And if there were any doubt about the president's knowledge of these events, official documents have come to light which leave no doubt whatsoever.
Any person reading these reports will be shocked and will realize that Syria is living a true crisis. Killing, criminality, suppression of protesters.
There are no simple solutions, and these challenges are made even more difficult by the realization that the opposition is deeply divided. The spate of suicide bombings in Damascus and Aleppo has added another element of unpredictability to an already inflamed situation. All that played into Bashar al-Assad's argument that the Syrian opposition, in whatever guise, is somehow connected to al-Qaeda, a claim the regime continues to use to justify the crackdown. Meanwhile, the weeks slip by, the death toll climbs, and the casualties continue to mount.
Professor Van Dam, NIKOLAOS, the first question that comes to mind is, why, unlike Libya, Yemen, certainly Tunisia and Egypt, why is Syria taking so long?
I think the core issue is that the composition of the regime, of the regime's elite, of its power institutions, the armed forces, the security institutions, and so on. In all these places, all sensitive places of the regime's power institutions, there are people who are very closely linked to the president and the people surrounding him, mostly with an Alawite background. And the Alawites are originally a downtrodden minority, which used to be discriminated against also by the Sunni population. They considered even their religion to be heretic. So these people are sticking together. Of course, they have a history from before. At first, the Ba'ath regime was much more diverse, but gradually all factions were disposed of, and there was one faction which remained, which was at the time the faction of al-Assad. And he was the only one who really decided what happened.
So it's the same premise for why the regime has preserved its power all these years, are the same reasons why it is still holding power nowadays?
Exactly. This has remained the same for the past 40 years and even longer. And I think what originally the role of Alawites in the regime was a stimulus for social change and so on. But once these people established themselves, became more rich, they become an obstacle to social change, but also they're an obstacle to a peaceful transformation from dictatorship to a regime which is more democratic or less dictatorial.
Is that, Robert, the reason why many people discount the possibility of diplomatic solution or a peaceful transition?
Well, I think probably when he took over from his father, which is when I first met Bashar, I think he genuinely had an idea of changing Syria for the better. He realized what was wrong with Hafiz's rule, with his father's rule. And of course, it wasn't meant to be him. It was meant to be his brother who was going to become president, but he died in the road accident on the way to the airport. I think what has happened, you see, is that Syria has been ruled by repression for so long that the moment you suggest that you're going to give way on power, the people want more. It happened with Mubarak, it happened with Ben Ali. As soon as you make one step in their direction, they want more than you're offering. So you have to keep retreating. But of course, when you've used repression on such a scale, I'm talking about the Hafez regime, Hafez al-Assad, what happens is that the longer the repression goes on, the more fearful you become of what will happen if you give way on everything. So the government has to fight for its survival out of fear as much as out of its own belief in itself.
So that's why what started as a demand for reforms in Daraa and later on up in the north
wasn't torture in Daraa, actually.
Yeah, but what started as a demand for reform in the system was completely rejected.
As peaceful demonstrations, unarmed, which became armed demonstrations later on. Yes, absolutely. But you see, I think what happens is that you've got a situation where a secular regime, which is what it claims to be, has become a sectarian conflict. It's dealing with a sectarian conflict.
You accept that, Annan? You accept the premise that although there's a sectarian element at the heart of the issue here, this goes beyond sectarian divisions.
Absolutely. I think it's to do with the structure of power in Syria. What really completed the job in Tunisia, Egypt, to a certain extent, is the army. At the end of the day, NVS struggle, non-violent struggle, is something that is against dictatorship, which relies on pillars of support. So the more you can get from these pillars of support to side with you or to be neutral, then you can get these dictatorship down. In the case of Syria, the main institution, which is the army, is still holding with the regime. And as long as the army is still holding with the regime, the revolution will continue for some time until either the army decides to side with the people or start to fracture from...
And do you see signs of that happening? More people deserting the army?
We are seeing more and more defections, but not at the level that will make the army disintegrate at this moment of time.
And why is that taking so long? If the army is majority Sunni anyway and so on. Well, so it is not a question of sectarian identity there.
The majority Sunni in terms of the soldiers, but when we talk about the high-ranking officers from lieutenant to upward, we're talking about 1,200 high-ranking officers in Syria. Out of this 1,200, at least 1,000 are from the Alawite background. And these are the people who are the real decision makers within the army.
Yeah. I think there's one thing we're not sort of concentrating on in the case of Syria, and that is that I've noticed that where nations which have revolutions have strong trade unions, Tunisia and Egypt, Mahala, for example, the cotton factory, cotton town north of Cairo, where the trade unions have been strong, there's been much less bloodshed. But where the trade unions have been part of the regime, there have just been facades, as in Syria, unfortunately, and in Yemen, and particularly in Libya, there has been much more bloodshed. And what is missing is not just an army that fractures, which is what you're talking about, or an army that stands with the people, which is what happened certainly in Egypt and to some extent in Tunisia. You're lacking a social cohesion beneath the military in the social side, where trade unions, the idea of leftist thought, the idea of equal spread of opportunities simply isn't there. It's based on a grouping of minorities in Syria, and you don't have this strong trade union movement which could give a political foundation to many of the statements that are being made at the moment.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
Concerning the disintegration of the army, all those or most of those who have deserted are Sunni soldiers, but they cannot do anything because they cannot take with them any arms. So as long as there are no whole armed units who desert, the opposition cannot do anything, well, cannot do much. And besides, the elite units and the best equipped army units are Alawi dominated.
The Republican Guards?
Yes, they are fully, or to a big majority Alawite, so they are loyal to the regime.
You don't see a process by which the opposition is increasingly arming itself, and more segments of the army are out there and probably will be armed more and more as time goes by?
You could say that it's a very asymmetric battle Because on the one hand, you have a few military lightly equipped. They can do something, they can be a huge nuisance, so to say, between quotation marks for the army. They can hide in somewhere in cities. They can have armed attacks on roads, on the side of the road, but they are not really a military threat. They can trigger, however, a lot of violence because the regime with its armed forces will enter cities and will try to get those people. And this has a lot of what they call collateral damage.
But despite that, you think the arming of the revolution is imminent or not in Syria?
Well, some parties, some countries, like Saudi Arabia, have announced that they are willing to arm the opposition. I think if they would arm the opposition, if they will have more arms, there will be more bloody conflict. So in the end, I don't think it will help much. It will more easily lead to civil war.
That's my sense, Robert. My sense is that we are escalating towards civil war.
But I tell you something. There's something where all the world is afflicted by in the Syrian conflict, and that's wishful thinking. Because so many people have decided that Assad is a new hate figure after we had Saddam and we had sort of Mubarak. Oh, he's going to be toppled. We've been told this in the New York Times. He's past the tipping point and all the usual cliches. We've been told that Homs was going to be the new Benghazi, the stepping off point for the revolution to go to Damascus. I think it's time we stop the wishful thinking. Because regimes are dictatorships doesn't mean they're going to go as fast as we think they will. I think that the Syrian
But they will?
Syria is going to change in the end. Even the Hezbollah privately say that when I talk to them. They know it's going to change. I think Bashar knows it's going to change, though where he's going to be, I don't know. But I think it's not going to change as fast as we think. As NIKOLAOS quite rightly said, in effect, you can't fight a tank with a Kalashnikov. It doesn't work. And even if the Saudis, who are very keen to keep their claws clean while offering guns to other people, even if they send weapons, and they can't send tanks to Syria.
But Robert, a lot of the asymmetrical cases of war, mostly the weak has won. When it takes long.
You're not talking about World War II.
No, I'm talking within
revolutionary groups.
Mostly, it has been the light arms that won because if they feel that justice
you wouldn't say that at Hama in 1982, would you? You see, in Hama, the weak rose up in an Islamist revolution, and the regime, with the full diplomatic support of the United States, ruthlessly crushed the uprising.
But you certainly agree that this revolution, or this upheaval, this uprising, is far more popular than anything we've seen in those Syria.
But I'm not sure it's winning. I'm not sure it's winning.
But is time on its side? Or, yes. is time on the regime side? Of course not.
Time up to a point is on the regime side.
Anas, in terms of the opposition, and you are one of those who represent segments of the opposition, or the main body of the opposition, you are being blamed for why this is not working. You're not united. You don't have a single message to the rest of the Syrian party, which explains why major sector of the Syrian society, such as Damascus and Aleppo, are not joining the revolution.
Well, I'm afraid this is true. The Syrian opposition has not been up to the standard required by the revolution and by the Syrian people. But we should also remember that the Syrian opposition did not start the revolution in the first place, and it's not leading it at the moment. It's basically led by activists on the ground, and the Syrian opposition, in a way, still imprisoned within its traditional thinking and traditional framework.
Is it still leaderless? I mean, various autonomous, segmented opposition from various parts of the Syria?
Absolutely, and I think this could be one of its main strength points of the revolution, that it's in fact it's leaderless revolution, which does not give the dictatorship the ability to crush it, that does not give the dictatorship the ability to obliterate it. But on the other hand, it gives us a huge challenge in terms of communicating with the Syrian people. And sometimes, in order to do that, you need a leader. You need somebody who commands a moral authority within the society. Now, I hope that the SNC will...
The Syrian National Council.
The Syrian National Council will develop into being such an institution. We're not there yet.
Is time on its side?
I think so. But
with the recent crackdown from the regime?
I think time is still on the revolution side, on the Syrian people's side. But in terms of the SNC, we have to do a better job.
NIKOLAOS, before we go to our second half to discuss the international aspects of this question, it seems to me that we have many who argued about and we just did that earlier, about the specificity of this country, of this situation. But it is coming in the midst of what everyone called the Arab Spring, that there is a revolution of consciousness in the Arab world. Do you see that there's a certain generalization that could be done, that Syria is part and parcel of a movement that is changing in the region, hence there is no turning back?
I don't think there's any turning back. I'm sure that the Syrian situation has been inspired by others, certainly how it began in the south, in Daraa. But it is, on the other hand, very specific, very Syrian. I think the whole Syrian population, or all groups, are participating in the opposition. It's very difficult in that respect to define the opposition. They are all fed up with dictatorship. And
like those in Tunisia and Yemen and so on.
But also many people have the impression that all this terrorizing the population, suppressing bloodily the population, that is something new because it has been visible now for a year. But this suppression has gone on for tens of years already. And one of the problems is, or one of the issues is, that those people inside the regime, they're just used to using violence without having any accountability. And so that's very difficult to stop.
Is that, Robert, why the recent use of excessive force against Idlib and Homs and so on and so forth is seen as a desperate attempt on the behalf of the regime, or is it actually a very strategic step that,
every time the bad guys do something violent, we say it's they're in distress, it's desperate. I don't think it necessarily is. Look, one thing you have to remember, as long as he holds Damascus and Aleppo, Bashar can carry on. And if you've got Idlib and you've got Homs as well, fine. But let me just add one other thing, and that is, we talk about the leaderlessness of the revolution. It's also a danger. I was in Egypt throughout the revolution, and the great thing they kept saying to me, look, nobody knows who the leaders are, they're just the youth, the activists, they don't know who to arrest. And when eventually the army moved in and happily took the place over, the Muslim Brothers came in with a perfectly well-grooved election machinery, and the people who started the revolution, who were in Tahrir Square, were left high and dry because they didn't have any leaders. Problem.
Absolutely. This is why I'm saying that the SNC hopefully will have time to develop into that kind of political leadership. So in a way, the revolution is going on, but that is giving us an opportunity to develop into that kind, and will not let any specific faction to take over.
There's just one other thing I'm going to ask you. In every revolution we've had so far, defectors from the regime or former members of the regime have turned up to be extremely influential in the post-revolutionary countries. Is that going to happen in Syria? Is there going to be a role for Uncle Bashar there at some point, I wonder?
I mean, if we look into how the NVS work, non-violent struggle works, we have to rely on such people. Because at the end of the day,
what do you mean non-violent?
And such people? What do you mean by such people?
The people from within the regime, because they are the people who've been governing the country for 40 years.
The biggest danger to the regime is from within the Alawite officers' corps, if you can call it that way. Because
so not just the politicians, but also from the officers' corps.
It's particularly the officers. There must also be a lot of criticism of the behavior of the regime. The only problem is, and that's a huge problem, is that if they only think about staging a coup, they may already be dead. So,
but do you see any signs of that?
No, not at all. Because if I would see them,
if anything,
the regime would,
it's not imploding at all. If anything, it's hardening.
Yeah, but it can be playing a role in the background.
But in the meanwhile, I think there is certainly the international powers and regional powers are coming to bear on this in the situation in Syria. But we're going to discuss that after we come back from a news break. Welcome back. With my guests, Nicholas Van Dam, Anas Al-Abdi, and Robert FISK. The international and regional powers have failed to agree on the diagnosis and the prescription for the escalating situation in Syria. The resulting paralysis has allowed the regime to intensify its crackdown and has pushed the opposition to arm itself. Russia and China have been adamant in their rejection of Western attempts at repeating the same diplomatic maneuvers in the UN Security Council that paved the way for NATO's military intervention in Libya under the pretext of the responsibility to protect. But lack of consensus at the UN doesn't mean lack of movement. The man responsible for the UN embracing the responsibility to protect doctrine, its former Secretary General, Kofi Annan, has been appointed special envoy to Syria as the violence spirals out of control. Meanwhile, the so-called Friends of Syria are heightening the pressure and raising the stakes by establishing a hardcore coalition of countries willing to act outside the framework of the Security Council, with dramatic consequences for Syria and the region.
Based on public statements from many Western leaders and opponents of the Assad regime, the situation in Syria is black and white.
What is happening in Syria is appalling. You have a government that is butchering and murdering its own people.
We do not accept a dictator who massacres his people.
How cynical that even as Assad was receiving former Secretary General Kofi Annan, the Syrian army was conducting a fresh assault on Idlib and continuing its aggression in Hama, Homs, and Rastan.
They say Syria is in the throes of a murderous regime out to crush all rebellion, with atrocities carried out against innocent civilians, and an opposition movement struggling to hold on against overwhelming odds. Those same leaders claim the international community is being thwarted, prevented from doing more by two nations out to prove a point.
My message to the Russian and Chinese governments is shame on you.
Russia and China have blocked the UN Security Council from any action which could form the legal basis for intervention in Syria, and they have been very clear why.
Some favor confrontation with authorities. Some endorse military action from forces inside and outside the country. These are all risky and could ignite conflict across the region.
China is a friend of the Syrian people. On the issue of Syria, our consideration is based on the Syrian people's fundamental long-term interests, as well as a regional peace.
That position has provoked a predictable response.
This is a doomed regime as well as a murdering regime.
What Moscow and Beijing are now willing to do is endorse the efforts of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to attempt to broker a ceasefire.
The first objective is for all of us to try and stop the violence, the human rights abuses, and the killings.
But this doesn't mean these two nations are going to bow to Western pressure. But what exactly does the West want to do? There is plenty of rhetoric and theatrics, precious little detail.
People realize that the West also are not particularly, might not be particularly enthusiastic about having radical change in the country. And actually what they want to do is reach a point where there can be a managed democratic transition in such a way as to keep the minorities happy in Syria, to keep the middle class happy, and also, and let's face it, to protect Israel's interests.
There is no doubt that any intervention, overt or covert, runs the risk of exacerbating the situation far beyond the current crisis. And that, for all the strong words and bellicose language, there is a sense that nobody actually has any intention at all of getting involved militarily. If Syria is indeed a step too far for the West, these same leaders certainly wouldn't admit it publicly. Instead, they'd need a convenient obstacle, a means by which they could continue to rail against Assad's regime, knowing full well they won't have to do anything about it. So in that light, are UN Security Council negotiations a frustrating process which is needlessly holding the West back? Or does the endorsement of Kofi Annan give everyone the wiggle room they need in order not to lose face diplomatically? Any discussion of the broader geopolitical dimension would be pointless without mentioning Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran is ready to give whatever support is needed to bolster the Assad regime, its strategic partner. Saudi Arabia is eager to offset that by arming the opposition. And they're not alone.
I think we should do whatever necessary to help them, including giving them weapons to defend themselves.
There is a feeling now in the grassroots movement in Syria that we cannot rely on the international community. And that's why there's been people have been hedging their bets on countries such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
What we're left with then is cautious support for a limited diplomatic overture, but no resolution, no intervention, and a regime still firmly in place. In other words, no end in sight.
Robert, Do you think Russia and China are going to change their minds anytime soon and vote in favor of Security Council regarding Syria?
They're not going to vote in a Libya-type resolution, that's for sure. I think they must be getting, I mean, the Russian foreign minister has already expressed in quite strong words his frustration with the Assad regime, acting too slowly, not coming forward with reforms in time. But I think that the Russians do genuinely believe that they were conned over Libya, that the no-fly zone suddenly became get rid of the regime zone very quickly. I mean, it was only a matter of days before we were bombing the Gaddafi house. So I think they genuinely feel misled there, and they do feel, as a great power, quote unquote, that they're not going to be pushed around anymore. But as many people have been saying, what are the Russians going to say to the revolution if the revolution wins? What are relations going to be like? Are they going to? Is the new revolutionary Syria, if it happens, going to say, "Oh, by the way, do keep your base in Tartus. We're very happy for you to have a naval base there"? I don't know. Not very pragmatic, but certainly very beating of the chest with Russia at the moment. As for China, I think what China wants to do is to have political strength in the Middle East commensurate with its economic strength. And that is why China is quietly pushing for a de-dollarization of oil. It's on that scale.
Is there anything for Russia to worry about, Anas, from a future Syria?
Absolutely not. Syria tries always to be independent of the major superpowers.
And geopolitically conscious of the importance of Russia?
Historically speaking, Syria has always been a friend of the Russian people. Syria will not be a Western base if the revolution wins, and it will not be an Eastern base as well. So Russia has nothing to worry about in that sense.
I understand that Russia is extremely unpopular among the opposition, but I think we shouldn't exaggerate the meaning of these vetoes, because they tried still to find ways to have a kind of dialogue to try to convince the regime, and well, then later on you can have a veto, but there was a hurry to have this veto.
But what Robert argues is that if there would have been a veto, perhaps the Western powers would have used it to do what they did in Libya. Would they have done that?
I don't think so, but it is of course a very valid reason for the Russians to be very careful. But there are other Security Council resolutions which have been vetoed by the United States, for instance. There is also Security Council
led the Palestinians into a great situation of injustice.
The famous or less famous Resolution 242, almost 45 years old, not having been carried out. So I think the reaction was over-dramatic.
Yeah. Do you actually think Western powers today, NATO, would actually intervene in Syria?
No, absolutely not. Look, there's two nations.
Why not,
there's two nations which are least critical of Syria. One is called Israel and the other is called Iran, which tells you a lot about the situation. I don't think Israel wants a war in Syria involving Western forces, because they will be involved. I don't think we have the taste for it. America has lost the war in Iraq. It's losing the war in Afghanistan. It's turning into anarchy over much of Afghanistan.
I don't understand.
The last thing it wants to do is get involved in another war.
But I don't understand. Let me tell you why there's a counter-argument to this. Any intervention Libya style in Syria will mean bombing the radar centers, bombing the land-to-air missiles.
And the presidential palace in Damascus.
Of course, which means paralyzing the Syrian military for decades. Why is that not in Israel's favor?
Because Israel's fear, and I think it's a wrong fear, but Israel's fear, of course, is Islamists will take over, al-Qaeda will take over.
Are you buying into this, by the way? There's a lot of talk recently about the whole al-Qaeda thing and foreign fighters.
I don't buy into al-Qaeda at all. One of the most important things of the Arab awakening, which is what I call it, is that there hasn't been a single picture of bin Laden, a single al-Qaeda flag raised by any revolutionary street group anywhere in the entire Arab world. So al-Qaeda's out, it's a has-been, and when Osama bin Laden died, he was already a has-been.
So in the process, Anas, the situation continues to deteriorate in light of the international paralysis, and suddenly we have the man who was, as I said earlier, responsible for the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, has been appointed envoy to your country. What are your expectations of UN diplomacy?
Well, our main hope is the fact that Kofi Annan is talking to Russia and China a lot.
So you actually have faith in his mission?
Well, I mean, we have no other option, you know.
Is this diplomacy a prelude to more pressure on the other Security Council members in order to go to military intervention?
Well, I mean,
Humanitarian intervention?
Let's remember that when Russia voted against the resolution, it was not voting against a Western-backed resolution. It was voted against an Arab League-sponsored resolution, meant at resolving the issue peacefully. And by the way, let me tell you this: one day before the Russia voted against, we were given a signal by the Russians that there is a breakthrough. Lavrov agreed to it. He sent to Bashar al-Assad the finally, which in our view was very, very much diluted. But he sent that resolution to Bashar. Bashar refused it, and as a result, the Russians voted against it.
If ever there is a military intervention, whether within the Security Council context or outside it, the coalition of the willing, so-called, you think military intervention will help Syria?
It will be disastrous for everyone, for all Syrians, for generations to come, I'm afraid. There have not been, in recent history and also in past history, there have not been really successful military interventions. Look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Libya. And people are already talking, but now unfortunately only talking about military intervention
But
in
NIKOLAOS,
Syria.
you are a student of Syria. Why are the Syrians, why there's a popularity for military intervention?
Well, I don't think there is much popularity, in fact, among the Syrians for military intervention. I
You think these are just loud voices among a silent
Well, these are
majority?
some people, of course, they are people who are desperate. These people from the people from the Free Syrian Army, they want help. But it doesn't really mean that they want military intervention. Military intervention will, in my opinion, also trigger civil war, which will be endless. And also just imagine that a foreign military intervention would topple this regime and would help bring into power, let's say, people from the majority, the Sunni majority, and they want to have and they want to have their day of revenge against the Alawites. Then these same intervention forces, they must then start to protect the people of the regime they have just helped topple. So this can be, and Bashar al-Assad, he was supposed to be a protector of the minorities, the Alawites in particular, but he turns out by the behavior of the regime to be the biggest danger for all those Alawites, also those who really don't dislike him or are against it, but cannot openly be against it.
We are not asking for international intervention in order to topple the regime. We are asking for international intervention to save civilians.
Is that semantics or is that strategic?
No, I mean, the thing is, if the regime stops targeting civilians now, nobody will ask for military intervention.
Of course not. But if it continues, would you be in favor of international or Western military intervention?
Since the veto was used, an average of 100 people are killed on a daily basis. I want people to give me an alternative.
But NIKOLAOS says it will get worse
if there's
a military intervention. In Libya, 1,500 died before the military intervention. 25 to 40,000 died after the military intervention to protect civilians.
Yeah, but if there was no intervention, probably there would be 300,000 in Benghazi who would be slaughtered.
Do we know that for a fact? Because they did enter some of these cities like Musrata and so on.
No, I mean,
but anyway, that's a different topic.
Gaddafi sent his troops to Benghazi, and he was stopped by NATO. Anyway, let me say
But he did enter Musrata, by the way, and he didn't do any of these atrocities.
The military intervention that we are talking about is not necessarily like Libya or airstrikes or anything like that.
It's probably worse, what we hear.
I think it may be much worse, because if you must make a calculation between being more principled and looking for justice and having much more bloodshed, or being more pragmatic and have less bloodshed.
One day after every military intervention, it always totally goes wrong. And it would go wrong in Syria immediately. Not least since we're reading our history books, because the Syrians have always fought the foreigner. They fought the Ottomans, they fought the French, and they fought the French again, they fought the Israelis. And look how quickly Afghanistan changed. We were supposed to go to Afghanistan because we loved them so much and wanted to give them freedom and women liberation and everything else. And what happened? We've got the whole of Afghanistan against us.
Okay,
now.
well, you see, after what happened in Rwanda...
Allow me, we're going to go
I thought we should mention Rwanda.
After what happened in Rwanda, the international community said never again. And it's happening again.
This is the responsibility to protect.
Absolutely.
And you think then there should be humanitarian intervention?
Absolutely.
It's also part of the responsibility of Kofi Annan, may I say so.
Yeah. He's the man.
Yes, the same guy. That's another thing you should be worried about.
Okay, let's discuss the possibilities, the three possible scenarios in my head anyway. Robert, the Algerian scenario in this case, meaning There's no military intervention, as in Algeria in 1991. France made sure no one interferes there. The generals then basically slaughter most of the people, call them terrorists, and they take
had,
care of the
after all,
situation.
been trained in France, hadn't they? Yes.
You think this, with Russian protection for the Syrian regime, you think this could be the scenario in Syria?
No, I think Algeria has nothing to do with that. Algeria is not Syrian, and vice versa. Because when the Algerian military were fighting against the GIA in the Orez Mountains and failing, they sent a delegation to Damascus to be taught by the defense brigades how they'd won in Hama, so that the Algerians would learn from it. Now there you go, and I was in Algeria when that military delegation returned from Damascus.
You're the one who says no military intervention. You think in that absence, you think we will have a repeat of the Algerian situation in Syria?
No, I don't think so. I think in general, gradually, every support for this regime will erode.
But you think absence of military intervention from the outside, will the opposition be able to take power, or at least out the
I think it will take some time. Perhaps the Baath regime has still its opportunity next year, March, to celebrate, between quotation marks, of course, their 50th anniversary.
It could implode and just fall apart.
Yes, it could implode.
Let me go to my second scenario. We discussed it slightly earlier, which is the Libyan scenario. You said Libya is not Syria, and now we're saying Algeria is not Syria. But certainly, there was no intervention on the ground in Libya. This was not Afghanistan or Iraq. Took care of all the defense, missile, this and that, the military bases. And basically, the regime in Libya more or less collapsed. And when the revolutionaries moved on, that happened. Could we expect, between Kofi Annan, the Russians, and the Western pressure for the Libyan scenarios to be repeated in Syria?
No, because Libya was being led by a raving lunatic, and Bashar al-Assad is not mad. He's a very sane man in comparison to Gaddafi. Libya, in my view, was never actually a proper nation under Gaddafi. It was a crazed place. You cannot draw parallels like that.
Do you think Assad is too smart to allow things to escalate that far for to be an international consensus against
the Syrian regime is much smarter than the Gaddafi regime, which was a tin pot organization. We know that. At least Assad
You agree with that?
The Syrian regime is smarter than Gaddafi. Absolutely, that's true. I think the Syrian regime will be forced into a political solution by a credible threat of military intervention.
So you think this will be a Yemeni scenario?
Exactly. If such a threat is told to Bashar, if you don't stop targeting civilians, and if you don't stop making change according to a roadmap agreed by the international community, we are going to bomb you. Then the Syrian regime will move.
So he agrees with you, and says NIKOLAOS, meaning some of the Alawite officers and so on and so forth will move on to say it's time for Bashar to move on and for us to hold some power in the country.
I think the president wants to do it the legal way, having elections and gradually his legal way, of course. But I think also I would like to bring up the so-called humanitarian corridors. Having corridors on Syrian territory means occupation. And having that occupation means that the opposition, of course, would like to extend its occupation or liberation. So I'm sure liberation. No, and the regime calls it, of course, occupation. It depends, because it's occupation by foreign forces, because the opposition itself cannot do it,
including the Turks and so on.
So that they will not accept it. They will try to shoot at those people who try.
What I'm saying is a credible threat will move the Syrian regime a long way. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so in the absence of that, and I will move to my last scenario, and perhaps maybe it is the worst possible nightmare, but maybe we are going in that direction. So here we are starting the arming of the opposition, and then within a year, when things really get bad in Syria, on the humanitarian level, civil war and so on and so forth, there will be an international intervention, and hence we have Balkanization. Are we re-witnessing the Kosovo scenario?
By which time the Syrian crisis will also have become the Lebanese crisis. It is amazing that the Lebanese, through their courage and good sense, have not yet got sucked
No, but I'm talking here
Syrian
about the Kosovo-Serbia scenario. Will you see the Balkanization, arming the revolution, arming, in that sense, the Kosovars, and later on intervening and the breakup of the country?
No, I'll tell you something very interesting about all the revolutions, and includes Syria. Oddly enough, all these countries have kept within their colonial borders. The Jordanians have not risen up and rushed to help the Syrian opposition. The Egyptians didn't rush in and help the Libyans, nor did the Tunisians. They've, oddly enough, their nations are just old enough to stick within their borders. And I don't think, we were being told by all the Tom Friedman School of Journalism that Iraq was going to be three nations, Kurdish, Sunni, Shiites at the bottom as usual, like in Lebanon. It never happened. Lebanon was going to be cantonized. It was going to be Kosovo.
We shouldn't worry about the breakup of Syria.
No, it's not going to break up. Syrians are much smarter than that.
What helps is that everyone in Syria is against civil war. Everyone is against sectarianism. Nobody wants it. So let's say from Arab nationalists, they're more Syrian nationalists now.
The Syrian revolution has built a new sense of national identity within the Syrian people that will be against sectarianism, will be against civil war, and against the breakup of Syria.
So you think the revolutionary consciousness that we've seen in the Arab world, that we are seeing in Syria, continues to be dominant?
It's still the main...
It's not losing steam.
Absolutely, absolutely not. It's more than...
It's a miracle.
Because of all this violence, that these people in Syria have the courage to revolt, whereas many people have a great probability that they will be killed.
Well, I'll tell you, with an issue of a miracle and the revolution going on and possibility of Syria not breaking up, this is good enough news for me to end. Gentlemen, thank you for joining Empire, and I'll be back with a final note. Fasten your seatbelts, or so I titled one of the final thoughts in my recent book, The Invisible Arab, The Promise and Pearl of the Arab Revolution. The next few years, I wrote back in November, promised to be difficult. The revolution's aftershock could be dangerous if people are not prepared to combat the looming forces of counter-revolution, which manifest in the region's pervasive dictatorships, in its reactionary and political religious movements, sectarian groups, and with cynical regional and international powers. The revolutions have added new elements of unpredictability to a region bridled with instability and conflict that the nascent revolutionaries will find hard to turn their back on. This is especially true as the seasons have turned on the Arab Revolution. The Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt gave way to a heated summer in Libya and Syria, leading to the deaths of tens of thousands. The regime's violent crackdown, the militarizations of the revolutions, and the international intervention in Libya have derailed the uprisings from their original popular democratic course. Now, there is every likelihood that the change will only come through military struggle. Though the Arab Maghreb and Egypt might begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel, the Arab Mashriq around Syria and Iraq isn't looking too bright. For all practical purpose, national sovereignty, personal liberty, social progress, and regional security are intertwined. Attempts at piecemeal dealings will fail utterly. And that's the way it goes. Write to me with your ideas and suggestions. Until next time.